Are we already in World War III? I know, it's a super provocative question, right? But according to the fascinating predictions we're digging into today, the answer might actually be a stark yes. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to impartially decode Professor Zhang's incredibly complex and honestly pretty alarming theories on how regional conflicts are supposedly spiraling into a massive global transformation.
We're calling this the domino effect. The source material we're looking at presents this massive interlinked theory of exactly how the modern world operates, and more importantly, how it might completely unravel. Now, our goal today isn't to take a political side or endorse any of these viewpoints. Instead, we're just going to clearly and neutrally map out this totally intricate web of predictions. We're talking economic triggers, military strategies, and some incredibly profound historical comparisons at the very heart of this framework.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at our roadmap for navigating these cascading global predictions. First, we'll look at the war for the petrodollar. Second, the global chessboard. Third, choking the world's trade. Fourth, shockwaves at home. And finally, the Bronze Age collapse.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the war for the petrodollar. So it all starts with the petrodollar. Basically, this is the global practice of pricing and trading oil exclusively in US dollars. The framework argues that American global dominance literally relies entirely on the rest of the world needing dollars just to buy energy. It operates under the assumption that if nations just stop trading in dollars, well, the U.S. empire faces collapse. And that means everything from massive global trade networks right down to the purchasing power in your very own wallet is completely directly tied to this system.
And that brings us to the BRICS threat. Think back to 2022. Remember when Russia was heavily sanctioned and essentially cut off from the global US dollar payment system? Well, Professor Zhang hypothesizes that this event was the ultimate catalyst. It basically forced Russia, China, and Iran to collude and form this massive geographic trading bloc. By choosing to trade in gold instead of US dollars, and by planning this vast Eurasian railway to completely bypass the oceans controlled by the US Navy, they theoretically pose a direct existential threat to that petrodollar system we just talked about.
And this brilliantly illustrates why the source argues a military response to this threat is just so incredibly difficult. Think about it. In 2003, Iraq's flat desert topography allowed for rapid aerial shock and awe strikes that pretty quickly toppled the regime. But Iran? It's basically a massive mountain fortress. This kind of rugged geography totally neutralizes aerial dominance, essentially forcing any invading power into a prolonged, hidden war of attrition, where weapons and bases are shielded deep, deep underground.
Moving right along to Section 2, the global chessboard.
Now, I want you to imagine global politics not as this random, unpredictable chaos, but actually as a game governed by very strict rules and incentives. That is game theory. By understanding these specific incentives, the theory goes that we can accurately predict how nations will behave in their own best interests. It's literally like watching grandmasters calculate their next move in a massive, incredibly high-stakes game of chess.
So who exactly are the players in his global chess game? The framework impartially maps out some very distinct motivations. First, the U.S. strategy is framed as creating a fortress America, using things like tech supremacy and the U.S. dollar as its primary weapons. Then you have Russia, aiming to unite Eurasia as a third Rome, leveraging its vast geography, land artillery, and shadow fleets. Iran's strategy is to lead the Muslim world, utilizing its mountain topography, drones, and regional proxies. And finally, Israel is described as being driven by the Greater Israel Project, relying heavily on its diaspora influence and advanced intelligence networks, like the Mossad.
Now, if we apply this game theory to a hypothetical conflict between the U.S. and Iran, the source predicts a very specific three-pronged U.S. strategy to force capitulation. Step 1 is to establish forward operating bases right on the borders, arming ethnic insurgents to try and force the Iranian military out of their mountain fortresses. Step 2 escalates things dramatically, establishing a strict naval blockade to completely choke off Iran's oil revenue. And Step 3? That's the ultimate squeeze, strangling the capital city's access to water, food, and electricity, basically trying to force the population to demand a political settlement.
That brings us to Section 3, choking the world's trade.
The amount of economic leverage held in the Strait of Hormuz is honestly kind of staggering. I mean, we're talking about a remarkably narrow 33-kilometer maritime choke point. Yet somehow, it handles a full 20% of the entire world's energy exports. Plus, it's absolutely crucial for shipping agricultural fertilizer to East Asia, which, as you know, ultimately impacts food prices everywhere.
The source highlights that simply by using drones to threaten this one strait, maritime insurers will just flat out refuse to cover cargo ships. This effectively shuts down a massive portion of the global economy without even needing a major military engagement.
1,000. So the crucial point is, according to this framework, that is the sheer number of shadow fleet tankers Russia currently uses to evade global sanctions and quietly ship its oil. It basically acts as this giant, unofficial navy, constantly maneuvering around economic blockades just to keep the Eurasian alliance fully funded and energized.
And here is exactly where the source predicts a direct collision course. To maintain its global hegemony and actually counter these shadow fleets, the theory is that the U.S. strategy has to expand to physically controlling other major global maritime choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, for instance. By blockading these vital routes to stop rival trade, the framework argues that we're going to see direct, pretty much unavoidable flashpoints between massive naval fleets right out there on the open ocean.
Let's zoom in a bit now. Section 4, shockwaves at home. The predictions here start hitting incredibly close to home for individual citizens. 18 to 24. Professor Zhang theorizes that just to sustain these long-term grinding conflicts, the United States will eventually have to initiate an automatic, mandatory military draft targeting basically all males in this specific age bracket. As you can imagine, that would radically alter domestic life for an entire generation.
Furthermore, the source makes a highly controversial and frankly pretty sci-fi sounding prediction regarding domestic control, the rise of an AI surveillance state. This theory outlines a future where governments roll out mandatory digital IDs, which are then perfectly paired with programmable digital currency. By utilizing artificial intelligence to literally categorize your civilian online behavior, the framework warns that authorities could automatically restrict your individual everyday purchases. Basically, your ability to buy things would depend entirely on whether or not you comply with state mandates.
Let's neutrally map out the hypothesized timeline for this domestic chaos. And remember, this is highly speculative. It starts with conflict initiation in the Middle East, right around 2024. Then by 2026, as the war inevitably escalates, we see that automatic draft registration taking effect. Finally, culminating in 2028, the framework theorizes that emergency war powers could be leveraged to find constitutional loopholes, potentially delaying elections altogether or even securing an unprecedented third presidential term.
Now, for our final section, Section 5, the Bronze Age collapse.
To really grasp this grand historical lens, the source relies heavily on the classic allegory of Plato's cave. If you're not familiar, this is a philosophical concept suggesting that the general public is essentially chained up inside a dark cave, just watching these fabricated shadows cast on a wall by some hidden elite. The framework argues that the modern global economy, managed by huge financial institutions and mass media, is exactly this. It's just an illusion carefully designed to keep populations compliant and completely distracted from the true, hidden mechanics of power.
Professor Zhang actually summarizes this massive unraveling with a really stark warning. He says, when empires collapse, infrastructure collapses. The closest historical analogy to today is the Bronze Age collapse. Basically, he argues that we are currently living right in the twilight of the American Empire, and its eventual unraveling is going to directly mirror the sudden dramatic fall of those ancient civilizations over 3,000 years ago.
Let's move to and see how this builds into a total systemic failure. The framework essentially argues that we are repeating history, literally point by point. Just like during the late Bronze Age, we are seeing extreme national debt and widening inequality, which is all being compounded by global climate crises and the very real threat of famine. Plus, our immense over-reliance on highly vulnerable global supply chains, especially for things like agricultural fertilizer, perfectly mirrors those ancient vulnerabilities. And ultimately, all of this pressure leads to a massive migration of refugees, or what the ancients called the Sea Peoples, completely overwhelming established, stable societies.
Wow, okay, we've obviously covered a tremendous amount of ground today, unpacking what is a deeply complex and, frankly, pretty alarming view of the world's trajectory. But interestingly, the source leaves us with a surprisingly empowering takeaway. The idea is that if the macro global systems are faltering, the actual solution lies in the micro. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If the shadows on the wall are really just an illusion, what reality will you choose to build in your very own community? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.